Hey, I am honored to be here with my friend and colleague, Professor James Reimer at the University of Ryukyus in Okinawa, Japan, who is a major expert on corals and the symbionts. So, and there's nobody I could think who would be better to ask questions about the topic of coral bleaching. So can you give for a interested laywoman audience 4-sentence description? What is coral bleaching?
4 sentences. Okay, so
6
thank you, Prof.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, 4 sentences. I must
maybe 8. That order of magnitude.
I need also. Okay. So the first thing, I think the first thing you have to realize is that the coral is actually, it's symbiosis. So it has a symbiont. And this symbiont is giving the coral the energy, or much of the energy it needs to live. So the symbiont is actually, they're dinoflagellates, which are small, single-celled protists. And these dinoflagellates, they're actually, they perform photosymbiosis, similar to plants. So they're using energy from the sun, or they're getting sunlight from the sun, and they're converting it into energy. So these corals are basically they're animals, but they have almost solar-powered plants, small single-celled solar-powered plants inside them. And so this is the basis for what we call modern shallow water coral reefs. Actually, I think all of you, or some of you maybe have been diving on a coral reef, and the visibility is very clear, which is really great for diving, but that means for the animal, there's not much food in the water. So without these photosymbionts, you wouldn't have coral reefs. So this symbiosis between the dinoflagellate and the coral, this is the key to coral reefs. And the problem is these dinoflagellates, like Superman with Krypton or kryptonite, these dinoflagellates have a weak point, and their number one weak point is high water temperature. And I don't mean like boiling water. I mean like maybe 1 degree higher than normal. So usually we say around 30 degrees Celsius. So oceans in the Philippines, where you are, Klaus, or in Okinawa, where I am, the summer average temperature is like 29.5. So these animals are really living close to their limits. They're just on the edge of what's possible. So what happens is in global warming, or in an El Nino event, for example, the water gets a little bit warmer than usual, but that's enough to cause problems for these dinoflagellates. They start to do photosymbiosis too quickly, and they're inside their cells. Their photosymbiosis machinery basically breaks down. It's moving too fast. Boom! It blows up, and these symbionts become like poison to the coral. And so the coral then it's like, oh no, and it spits out these symbionts, or it eats them, it digests them because it's trying to get energy. But the result is that you end up with corals that have no symbionts inside them, and the corals turn white in color, which is why we call it coral bleaching. And so corals can recover from coral bleaching, but if they don't get their symbionts back in a couple of weeks or so, they basically starve to death and die. So that's, in a nutshell, how you could think of coral bleaching. It's probably 10 sentences, but that's a very simple explanation.
That was perfect. So basically, they're losing their livelihood in terms of bioenergetics because it just gets too hot.
Yeah, they're losing their source of food, basically, or their major source of food. Some will also eat a little bit of plankton, but they're on a crash course diet all of a sudden because it's a little bit warmer than usual, and their symbionts are unhappy.
Yeah. So what I've observed, for instance, in Negros Island, where I'm, that different reefs bleach to different degrees. And what would be the causes for this?
Okay, so there's a couple things that could be happening there. One would either be the environment, and the other would be the animals that are on the reef, the different corals. So by environment, there's a lot of variation, small variation in the environment. Maybe at one of your sites, the water is a bit cooler, or maybe there's upwelling, or there's a bit more of a current, or that's keeping the temperatures a little bit lower. And that might be just enough to help the corals. The other thing that you could consider is that maybe the corals at these different reefs are different. And so there are corals and there are symbionts that we know are stronger against higher temperatures, and other ones that are weaker against higher temperatures. For example, you can pronounce it Acropora or Acropora, the branching corals. They're often very, very weak against higher water temperatures. And they often have a type of symbiont we call cladocopium, or old clade C, we used to call it. And this type of symbiont, not all of them, but many of these cladocopium species are also quite weak against high temperatures. So, but then you also know Porites. It's like the big mounded, rounded corals. Those things are really strong against bleaching. And they have a different cladocopium that's really strong against high temperatures. So if you have differences in your coral communities or difference in your symbiont communities, and you have differences in your environment, you end up with a very sort of a mosaic pattern of bleaching.
So basically, it could be a colder currents coming from deeper ocean areas, or the composition of the reef. Oh, interesting.
Or both. It could be even both. Yeah. It could be both at the same time.
A combination, yeah. So another thing which I've actually covered in the Furche newspaper a few months ago is ocean acidification. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, major problem how the capability of corals to fixate carbonate skeletons will be weaker. How would that interact with coral bleaching? Wouldn't it really be a 1-2 punch for their health?
So this is kind of one of those what's going to happen questions. I'm not an acidification expert as much as a bleaching or an ocean warming expert. But from the studies that I have seen, you get a lot of variation in individual corals and how they're impacted by acidification, and also under different bleaching regimes. So I think the jury is still out as to exactly how much of a 1-2 punch this is, but I think there's some very serious potential there. I mean, basically, you're taking away the coral's ability to effectively produce a carbonate skeleton, and you're also taking away the energy that it needs to build the carbonate skeleton, and you're also taking away its food source at the same time. So this could be something down the road that could really not sneak up because we know it's coming, but this is something, this 1-2 punch that could really devastate corals more than we could even imagine now. But again, there's a lot of variation out there, and I'm not an acidification expert. So some people think acidification is the most dangerous thing. Other people think it's global warming. I don't want to bet on either of them, but I think they're both potentially bad news.
So essentially, humanity is causing two different problems for coral, but it's not quite clear how they will interact, because this is just a very complex system. We have the environment.
Yeah.
And
I think I think the evidence on global warming is very clear. And I think it's pretty clear that corals are in trouble. Even without acidification, corals are many shallow water corals are in trouble. However, you throw you throw acidification into the mix, and I think that, as you said, complicates things even more. So yeah, it's as Yoda the Jedi once said, the future always in motion. It's a hard thing to predict, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I of course it's hard to predict, but you can learn from the past. And I know you just published a very insightful paper on coral evolution, right? So,
yeah, thank you.
I really enjoyed reading that, and I really enjoyed the figures particularly. And so, given your insights from previous episodes of, I think you call it a reef crisis, correct?
Yeah. Basically, so throughout geological history, corals have gone through, 3, 4, 5 different times of crises in which the ocean chemistry was not conducive to corals building their skeletons, or, for example, giant asteroids hitting from outer space. That would also be considered a crisis of sorts, right?
Yeah. So that's the asteroid which wiped out the dinosaurs, of course, right?
Yeah, among others, right?
Yeah.
So there's been periods that have been very, very tough for corals in the broad sense. So I'm not only talking about hard corals that you and I see on the reefs, but all anthozoans, including soft corals or sea pens or zoantharians or anemones or all of these different groups. And what we found looking at all of this past data and this recent research is that these reef crises, they cause a lot of extinction, but they also drive a lot of unique evolution. And so the groups of the wide sense of corals, the groups of corals or anthozoans that have some flexibility in how what strategy they have to survive, whether they build a hard skeleton or they're in the deep sea, or they make sclerites, or they have strong muscles instead of a skeleton. These animals that have more flexibility, they seem to be able to pass through these events and diversify more quickly. And then as things become more stable, then the hard corals or other groups slowly start to diversify. So, you could take this and extrapolate this. Okay, so now we're in a reef, we're in the Anthropocene, we're in an extinction crisis. And it's hard to see because, we only live 100 years, maybe, if we're lucky. But if you took this over 10,000 or 100,000, yeah, exactly. So, what are reefs going to look like in the future? And given acidification, given global warming, it's a tough thing to predict. But looking at the past, we can get some ideas. And this is very positive or very grim. You can take it either way you want. I believe many species will go extinct in the next 1,000 years. Many in the wide sense coral species. But I think in the long run, corals as an entire group will far outlive humans. They have been around for hundreds of millions of years, and they have survived multiple crises in the past. Will reefs in the future look like reefs now? No. There might not even be reefs for some point in time. But I am pretty certain that we need to be worried about humans. And if we're worried about humans, we need to be protecting the environment and the reefs that are on them. You can get some hints as well for the short term from looking at reefs, say for example, in some of the more heavily industrialized areas of Okinawa or Singapore, or Hong Kong, or maybe there's some ports in the Philippines. Yeah. And most people never go diving there. They're not big tourist spots, they're kind of murky and we call it muck diving, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But there's corals there, right? There's the parietes, those tough corals. There's a lot of sponges.
Sea pens seem to like
sea pens, non-zooxanthellate, the ones without the symbionts. So the thing is these are not necessarily beautiful reefs from a touristic point of view, or they're not the reefs that we're used to seeing in the Indo-Pacific, but they are ecosystems, and they do have diversity, and they are functioning. And so those reefs are going to become more common, and the beautiful, from a human point of view, reefs with the clear waters, those are going to become few and far between.
But we'll still have
in the
reefs.
Short term. In the long term,
yeah.
Well, there'll be anthozoans in there for sure. Far after we've gone the way of Denisovans or Neanderthals or everything else, there'll still be reefs. So does this mean we shouldn't care? No,
yeah, course.
We need to care, right? And we want to protect those beautiful areas. And we're not going to be able to get as many, say, fish that we depend on. It's going to be more murky. Of course, we want to protect reefs. But this isn't the extinction of everything. This is a massive reorganization completely driven by humans.
Yeah. So it's a reorganization away from this, Apo Island type of reefs, and it's towards corals without Manila Harbor. Yeah, I mean, that is a little bit depressing, but as you said, like the other corals live. Deep thoughts, deep thoughts.
Well,
Yeah.
but sort of semi-happy. But I think the main thing though is we're used to getting a lot of our at least in Okinawa traditionally, and also probably in many places in the Philippines, a lot of the sustenance or a lot of the cultural importance is attached to these reefs as we know them now, which have been very stable. And that's changing. We're not going to be able to get parrotfish or, sea turtles or, all of these things that humans have utilized.
Yeah.
It's going to be more cyanobacterial mats and sponges and things.
So we will have to find a way of making food tablets from the cyanobacterial mats.
Yeah.
You can discuss.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, who knows? Like it's but it's something. I think there was a French person. What was his name? Serge Plains. I saw one of his presentations, and he was really hammering home. Reefs are not going to go extinct. They're going to change, but the reefs aren't going to go extinct. It's what's in the reefs that's really going to be reshuffled. And we've seen that even in Okinawa. We have some data from 46, 47 years ago, and a lot of branching corals, not so many massive encrusting parietes, and now it's completely switched in some of these areas. And what you also get something called have you heard of reef compression?
No.
It sounds kind of cool. It sounds like a diving term, but it's actually not very good. Reef compression is before humans started really heavily impacting reefs, you had this clear water that I talked about. And so you had reefs from 0 to maybe 50, 60, even 100 meters, right? In the mesophotic zone down there.
Yep.
So what's happened is we have global warming, and we also have eutrophication in many areas, locally speaking. And so the top 5 or 10 meters of reefs has been hammered by high water temperatures, and so all of these shallow water corals have really, really been hammered. The ones that still exist are maybe at 5 or 10 meters. They're deeper. At the same time, the visibility in the water has gotten worse, so that these corals that were at 50 meters, they can't survive. So they've come up. So you have the reef that used to be like sorry, I'm trying to get my hands on the camera. The reef that used to be like this is now like this. And so the areas that you find all of these corals, it's become shrunk in a vertical sense.
Well, that's a lot of information.
And now my internet decided to freeze.
That's a lot of information. I would really like to thank you. I think our viewers will have a lot of questions. Please leave them in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. Rich deep thoughts, and brilliant. Thank you so much. And
no, thank you. It's been fun to talk. It's been really good. And let's keep diving and be somewhat positive about it while we can, right?
For sure.